Good morning and welcome to our happy Wednesday to all of you. I'm your host. My name is Indus Khetan and I run marketing at Sirion. Today we have a fantastic topic of plugging value leakage in IT outsourcing engagements, and we have two great speakers who are going to set the topic and bring out the challenges and opportunities a CIO's organization faces in the ever-changing digital transformation of enterprise. Before I jump into the agenda, just a quick set of housekeeping items around the webinar. So as you would notice on your control panel for GoToWebinar, there is a question and answer panel. So feel free to type in your questions and we will read it out to the panel as we progress through the webinar or have the Q&A at the end. You can also participate in the Q&A at the end, but again, just keep typing your questions and I'll try to read it out as the webinar progresses. Everybody's on mute and this webinar is being recorded, and a URL for the recording would be shared once the webinar is over. With that, let me just share a quick agenda in terms of what we're going to touch upon. So today's agenda is in two parts. We'll first talk about how ineffective governance is creating the value leakage in IT outsourcing engagements and the current gaps around it. Then we'll discuss how Sirion addresses these gaps and a solution around it. So with that, let me introduce to the two fantastic speakers today. I have Andrew Bartels. Andrew is a Vice President and Principal Analyst at Forrester. As an analyst, Andrew engages with industry-leading CIOs and advises them on tech market trends in the areas of cloud, smart computing, and helps them with tech budgeting and processes. Andrew also researches the growing customization of systems in the industry verticals for utilities, energy, government, and education. Andrew has been with Forrester for 15 years. My next speaker is Ajay Agrawal. Ajay is the CEO and founder of SirionLabs. Before starting Sirion, he founded United Lex Corporation in 2006, a legal process outsourcing company, and led the company through a rapid growth which created more than 100 million in enterprise value. Ajay is also an entrepreneur at residence at Codex, a center for legal informatics at Stanford University. With that, I hand it over to Andrew. Andrew, over to you.
Thank you very much. I guess good day to you. I won't try and guess what time's on your end, but thank you for joining us today. I'm going to as our moderator has indicated, we're going to be talking today about plugging value leakage in IT outsourcing engagements. Actually, I think it'll be even broader, not just IT, but other types of consulting engagements. Certainly, the outsourcing is the focal point of that. Go to the next slide, please. Now, firms, CIOs like you folks on the line, you'll buy lots and lots of consulting and outsourcing services. You're going to buy them from all the vendors that we show here, plus many others. Outsourcing and consulting services are key parts of any CIO's portfolio of vendors that they use to provide technology services to their business. And outsourcing certainly plays a key role in the operations and in the performance of firms. But outsourcing itself is an activity that is both costly but also subject to issues. Next slide, please. Outsourcing itself is a large portion of any CIO's budget. The data shown here is Forrester's estimates for the total tech spending by business and governments around the world on the different categories of tech goods and services. And as you can see, spending on tech outsourcing, which we also include hardware maintenance, although that's a small piece of it, it's about 17% of total external tech spending. Tech consulting and system integration service about 19%. So we're talking about numbers that are, half a trillion dollars each in terms of what the global spending is. And for most firms, their spending on IT outsourcing is going to tend to be in this range, 15 to 20%. Similar spending on tech consulting and system integration services. Now, our focus of this presentation, if you go to the next slide, please, is of course on the CIO, the outsourcing. But a lot of what we're talking about in this context can be relevant to other categories of spending that CIOs will be supporting as part of the corporation. This slide shows how total spending on professional services by firms in the U.S. breaks down by different categories of services. The things we're talking about today would fall in the category of custom computer programming, primarily things like other computer-related services and computer systems design services, which by themselves are about 20% of total U.S. firm spending on services. But many of the technologies and the practices we'll be talking about today, which focus specifically on outsourcing, CIOs can then turn around and utilize in helping the rest of their business in managing their spending and getting and really making sure that they're only paying for services delivered in categories like legal services, architectural services, management consulting services, advertising services, marketing research services, accounting services, the whole portfolio of services that big firms are buying. So while our focus point today is on outsourcing and by extension other tech consulting, just remember the solution that you might be looking at to solve that problem can be readily applied to help your firm with other categories of services that you might be buying as an organization. So let's go to the challenges around managing the spending. Next slide, please. Before I get there, I should mention as well that these other types of services that firms spend is a non-trivial part. Indeed, using data that's available for the U.S., in many industries, the spending that they do on services, professional, other services, is 70, 80, 90% of all their total purchases of external goods and services from outside their firm. So the big opportunity that CIOs can face, not only just solving their own problems, but also helping your firm solve how can it get more value from the broad portfolio of service it buys, especially in services industries where spending on services is in fact well over half of what you spend on technology. I'm sorry, not technology, everything you buy. Next slide, please. So the challenge, though, is how do you manage this? And here's the process that most firms go through when they choose a service provider and when they manage them. First of all, they start by defining a service they want to be provided. Then they choose a vendor, and then they scope, price, and time the services they'll be provided. And this is equally true whether they're talking about outsourcing service or talking about any kind of statement of work consulting service. Then they actually engage the service provider, actually put them to work at the tasks or at the outsourcing they want them to be done. Of course, though, launching a service engagement, whether outsourcing or project-based, is simply a start. You actually have a lot of work involved in managing that service provider to make sure that they're delivering what you want during the engagement, whether that's a 3-year outsourcing agreement or a 6-month consulting project. Then at the completion or at various milestone points within the engagement, you'll be receiving an invoice, and you need to validate that invoice and pay the vendor. And then, of course, you repeat the whole process for every service engagement. So this is the landscape of steps that are used by firms to choose, engage, manage, and pay the service providers that they use, whether outsourcing vendors or whether consulting statement of work type vendors. Next slide, please. Now, in support of these cycle, many firms today use a fairly set of manual tools. So they may use email and Microsoft Word, that was going to be used to put together their request for a quote, proposal, request for information. They will then use email to send that out. They use Microsoft Word as the document that you may use. They may have conferences, calls with the vendor to choose them before they end up deciding what they want to do. Then they'll actually engage in that. Again, you'll have emails to get that in place, conference calls to get it scheduled. Then you'll actually be tracking that vendor's performance through email. You may be using Microsoft Excel to keep track of the performance. Again, conference calls along the way, see how they're doing it. Then when it comes time for the invoice, you've got that email to you. You may be putting that information into Microsoft Excel. Your AP system is looking for the data. And these are all the sort of manual processes that firms typically use today in this process of choosing, engaging, managing, paying their service provider. But of course, as you can imagine, that's not ideal. So there also are a whole set of technologies that have emerged to help firms in each stage of this process. Next slide, please. Okay. So at Forrester, we define these as a cluster of technologies that we've put in the broad category of e-purchasing. So we're around defining the service to be provided. You typically find firms using spend analysis that they might use to identify categories that they want to put under agreement. Of course, in services, that's less true than in other ones, but you still find, for example, spend analysis playing a role in terms of identifying opportunities to do outsourcing or do sourcing. Then they may use an e-sourcing tool, something that automatically generates through an internal collaboration, the RFQ, RFI, RFX, solicit, send that out to suppliers, receive the responses, put that all together into a accessible comparison form, online form that the internal stakeholders can all review. And they may also be using a service procurement tool, especially with statement of work type services. Then, having chosen a vendor, that goes into a contract, and that's where contract lifecycle management comes to the fore. It's a vehicle that you use to define the relationship, whether that's an outsourcing relationship or whether it's a statement of work project. Then you engage with the vendor, and again, a contract is going to be used to define when the work starts, who they're going to be, who's going to do the work. A service procurement tool may come to the fore in terms of handling the onboarding of the service provider, the credential checking, or it may play a role equally in terms of keeping up to date with the credentials of the outsource provider, and especially if the outsource provider may have to come onto your premises. Then, in terms of managing that performance, we see products like supplier risk and performance management come to the fore. These are products that are designed to record and capture KPIs, key performance indicators, about how the supplier is doing. For example, surveys of the key stakeholders in the project or key customers, users of the outsourcing vendor to identify satisfaction with that vendor. Are they performing what they expected? Are they doing what they wanted? Have they completed the tasks that are supposed to be done, different milestones? And then those all feeding into the invoicing solution, which will then draw on data around the CLM product, around what's supposed to be done, information out of the SRPM product around performance, and then using those inputs to then generate, to then determine what part of the invoice should be paid, when should be paid, and how much of it should be paid. Next slide. Well, this whole process is important. We find that many CIOs spend most of their time on the front-end processes. They spend their time on defining what is service to be provided. They spend their time on choosing a vendor and the scope, making sure it's priced right. And then after that, they kind of say, okay, now we're not going to worry so much about it because we chose the vendor. We've got them in place. They're now working. Everything's moving along fine. I'm not going to worry too much about that because I'm sure things will work out just perfectly well. The vendors, of course, only going to charge us for what the work done, right? The vendors, of course, going to do a good job. The vendors, of course, going to live up to what they promised they're going to do. Well, of course, those are not of courses. There is a lot of slippage that can arise within the process from the front-end decisions about engaging a vendor to the actual monitoring and ultimately payment of work done. And that creates a lot of sources of slippage and leakage. Next slide, please. Which ultimately can result in firms having a gap between what they wanted to get and what they actually received and what they actually pay for. So you could have the work that's provided doesn't actually agree with the contract, or the work performance could be poor, or the invoice doesn't agree with the contract specifies. These are all sources of failure. So, well, it's certainly important for CIOs to focus on the front-end process, front-end activities of choosing vendors, negotiating contracts, getting work started. It's equally important to pay attention to the actual back-end process of vendor delivery, of vendor performance, and ultimately of payment, if you're going to make sure that you actually get what you paid for and you pay for what you actually got. So this is the landscape of issues and challenges that firms face. Before I get into how they solve them, let me talk a little bit about the solutions that are available today and how they play against these issues. So next slide, please. A key part of any management of a vendor agreement is, in fact, contract management. These are specialized tools that firms use to manage all the stages of a contract, whether that's an IT outsourcing contract, a statement of work contract, any other form of contract that's involved. And contract management involves, first of all, having your existing contracts available in an online repository so that anyone who has to monitor that, particularly a project manager, a vendor manager, a CIO, can see at any point in time what the contract specified that we're supposed to be looking at. Now, of course, contracts don't appear from nowhere. You want to have a tool for creating a contract. And so a contract drafting tool, a contract negotiation tool that allows the CIO himself or herself or his or her direct reports to create that contract, make sure that contract has all the terms and conditions that legal wants to see, make sure that in the course of negotiating, it stays in compliance with those terms and agreements, or if not, it gets routed to the right people in legal for approval. So you can end up then with an actual contract that is what you're going to use to govern your relationship. Now, in some cases, the contract is not done on your paper. It's done on the counterparty's paper. So you have to have a mechanism for pulling that contract in and then tagging it with all the right metadata tags. What's the actual contract specify in terms of the work to be done? What's the contract specify in terms of the timetable of work to be done? What types of recourse do we have in the event that there are failures? What's the payment going to be? When's it going to be paid? Is it going to be single lump? Is it going to be milestone? What's the expected billing rates? What's going to be the charge rates? Other things. All those are part of what you want to pull into the contract and make sure it's tagged in the appropriate way. So that in fact, you can then do contract compliance administration that looks across multiple contracts, be able to see which contracts do we have that have expiration dates coming up, which ones are linked together, which contracts do we have with the same vendor that may or may not have the right or similar terms in each of those. And then with those reports analysis, figuring out, okay, what is going wrong? Is the contract performing as we expected, or are we missing key terms we should have had? Are we running into issues such as intellectual property we didn't properly address in the contract? So contract optimization becomes a vehicle for making sure the contracts improve over time. And of course, contracts expire, so you want to be prepared for that. You want to get alerts when the contract is going to be expiring, so you can decide, do you want to renew it or do you want to cancel it? If you're in a 7-year outsourcing agreement, getting alerts in year 5 and year 6. So you can start thinking about, how do we renegotiate this contract? Do we want to keep it? And so forth. Next slide. So that's what CLM products do, and they play a vital role in any selection process or any process of managing contracts. Now, there is a lot that goes into both a CLM product and into implementation. I'm not going to go into all of the items here. It's part of what you'd want to be thinking about as you're looking at a CLM product, as well as what you want to think about in terms of implementation. But what I do want to focus on is these 6 different attributes, 6 different functions of CLM, each of which have their own sets of requirements in a tool, and each of which have their own sets of implementation. And those are things that, as you're looking at CLM product, you want to make sure that you have each of these. And as you think about implementation, you've got to identify all the parties involved. And you'll notice on the right side, there's a number of references to legal in this. So any CIO who's looking at CLM needs to be thinking about not just what do we in IT need, they need to be thinking about what do legal folks want to see in the tool and what's their role going to be in getting in place. And by the way, it makes no sense for an IT department to implement CLM just for IT contracts. But certainly you could use this opportunity as a way of finding a product that you could test and demonstrate in legal, and then take it more broadly across the organization to help with other types of contracts beyond the IT contracts. So that's what CLM products do, and they play a vital role in the whole process of managing your vendor relationships, especially outsourcing relationships. But that's only part of it. If we go to the next slide, you'll see what supplier risk and performance management tools can do. And we call them supplier risk and performance management because those are the focal points of what they do, but that's not the only aspects of it. Certainly, you want to have a single source of information about who the supplier is, where their office is, who their contact is, what banks you pay to, what's the bank account number, what certificates and licenses do they have, how to contact them. That all falls under supplier information management. Supplier risk management gets into issues of what are concerns we might have about the supplier. Top of mind office financial concerns. But they could also be, do they have the right credentials? For example, in certain types of IT outsourcing agreements, there may be requirements that the vendor be in compliance with certain information security rules and regulations to make sure that your data is protected accurately and that the vendor is compliant with, for example, local government laws around data residency. So getting information, having information from third-party sources around that vendor. Are the financials looking good? Do we want to keep them? Are there any issues around that? Are there any issues around their own compliance with the laws, their own having the right licenses? Keeping track of all of that is a key part of managing that vendor. Supplier performance management is more a case of your internal indicators. For example, on outsourcing, what's the response rate when you make a call to the outsourcing vendor? Are they getting back to you in the agreed upon time? Are there delays? Are they available 7 by 24 as the contract specifies, or are they only available 7 by 12 or 5 by 12? What's your employee satisfaction with them? Doing a quick survey of an employee who's interacted with your outsourced vendor to say, was it satisfactory? Were they polite? Were they responsive? Did they get your need taken care of? Did they respond quickly? There's a whole set of both KPIs that you want to be tracking, as well as qualitative information that comes from your employees and how they view that supplier. And then lastly, you want to start building up a database that you can use, ideally, ultimately drawing upon third-party information, but certainly your own, about what's the qualification of the supplier? What's our experience been with the supplier? Have we been satisfied with them? Are they done a good job in past engagements? Have they done a good job in other parts of the organization? And using that information to help you decide how much you want to utilize that vendor. And that whole set of activities we call supplier lifecycle management, but the most important ones are the supplier risk and supplier performance parts of this domain. So go to the next slide, please. Just as we saw some of the things to look for in a CLM system, there are similar things you want to look for in an SRPM system. And just as there are sets of steps involved in implementing a CLM, there are similar steps involved in terms of implementing a SRPM system. So both CLM and CRM or SRPM play a key role in any efforts that you might have to manage your supplier relationships, both to govern a contract as well as to manage the performance of that vendor. But that being said, there still are gaps. So let's come back to the next slide and look at what some of those gaps would be. For example, as I mentioned, the CLM system tells you what your contract is supposed to be. But how do you know what's the information that tells you whether in fact that's happening? What's the mechanism you have in place to make sure that the invoice you've been received is in fact in line with the contract? Maybe there is a way of getting the contract data in the system, but maybe there's not. And that involves then a manual effort to review each contract to see, oh, okay, the vendor's supposed to be billing us at this amount, paying for this amount. But if we're getting an invoice, how do we check to make sure that invoice matches? Where do we find the records of how it's done? So you want to make sure that in addition to supplier information, supplier risk performance management, and CLM, and an e-invoicing system you can use, there's a way to cross the T's and dot the I's to make sure that you get all the information about supplier performance, all the information about contracts into the invoice system consistently, time after time, not haphazard, to make sure that you're actually paying for exactly what you get. So if we can wrap up my section, we'll turn it over to Ajay. Here are the key recommendations that we certainly at Forrester we make to firms. Next slide. Certainly, you want to focus on this. You're spending too much on tech consulting, tech outsourcing services to leave it unmanaged. And not only are what you're spending on tech consulting and outsourcing firms big, but they themselves are just a portion of what your firm is spending on business and professional services. So you want to make sure this is a focal point of all of your efforts, both within the IT organization and for the IT organization as an entity that helps provide the tools to the rest of your firm for choosing, engaging, managing, and paying your service providers, whether those IT service providers if you're a CIO, or other types of service providers if the CIO is supporting the rest of the organization. Tools like e-sourcing, CLM, SRPM, e-invoicing are very important software tools that you can use to manage both your IT contracts and your IT relationships, but also to help your business partners manage their service contracts, their service relationships. But as you're utilizing these tools, make sure you're finding ways of closing all the gaps. Because great as these tools are, and they're very, very powerful, there will tend to be gaps that you want to make sure get closed. And that's what Sirion can help you with. So let me turn it over to Ajay, and Ajay's going to talk about the role that SirionLabs can play in closing these gaps and helping make sure that you get the value that you pay for in your services agreements, in your outsourcing agreements, not just in IT, but elsewhere in your organization. Ajay, over to you.
Thanks so much, Andrew, for that wonderful session and indeed for those deep insights. I'm going to try on this slide, this very busy slide, to put together a lot of what you've heard from Andrew in the last 30 minutes. And what I've tried to do on this slide is draw an anatomical representation of what a large Fortune 500 environment looks like. And on the left-hand side, I've portrayed the procurement cycle, which is typically 6 to 12 months for a complex services contract. And on the right-hand side of the slide, I've pictured the post-signature cycle, which is typically 3 to 5 years. And in the post-signature side, as we scroll down, we can see on the top, there are 5 different corporate silos who are simultaneously coming together to realize the anticipated value from the supplier. On the one side, you have the legal and contracts folks, and typically they would have invested in an electronic contract repository of some kind, pictured below. To the right, you see the service delivery folks, and they typically would have also invested in some sort of service request management or project management tool. And then, of course, there's the relationship aspect, and tends to get managed on Excel or Outlook. And on the risk side, we're starting to see now the GRC industry taking shape. And last but not least, the folks on the invoice side who are actually receiving the supplier's invoices. And the problem really, we can start the problem here, as Andrew pointed out. It's the inability of the poor chap receiving the invoice to correlate what was promised to what actually happened, and thereby intelligently audit the invoice. It is the breakdown of the three-way matching in the context of services invoices that really is the larger problem statement that we're addressing today. And the approach that Sirion has taken, and the one that I will talk about today, is not just filling the gaps in each of these 5 towers, but talking to all of them, integrating to all of them, and generating that cohesive, integrated vision that will help us to have a holistic view of the supplier engagement. Next slide. As a result of those gaps that we saw on the last page, there is now an emerging industry consensus. Forrester, Gartner, many other organizations, IAOP, IACCM, have observed that there is a tangible gap between the business case or the expected value and the value that's actually realized in complex services engagements, and particularly outsourcing engagements. On the lower side, industry experts estimated at about 20%, but there are estimates as high as 30 or even 35% leakage. And most experts agree that there are fundamentally 2 types of leakage, hard and soft. Hard leakage in outsourcing or complex services engagements is the tangible portion of leakage where if only you knew the difference between what was promised and what was delivered, you could actually reduce the invoice by that corresponding amount. So you get an invoice for $100, you know $6 of work was not done, you pay only $94, that's $6 of hard leakage saved. Soft leakage doesn't really tangibly correspond to an invoice reduction, but it does correspond to value received or value expected. And in case you're on top of your game and the supplier is playing ball, you can get that anticipated value. You can force the supplier to provide that anticipated value, but not necessarily in dollar terms or in invoicing terms. On the right-hand side here of the slide, we also see some of the most common forms of hard leakage. And not surprisingly, computational errors or just pure and simple mathematical errors are a very large part of it. Tracking the scope in these complex services engagements is also a very complex thing. A recent study by E&Y estimated that these contracts are changing about 200 times in an average duration of 3.5 years. That's roughly 6 times a month. Therefore, knowing what is included in your baseline invoice and not inside your baseline invoice is actually a non-trivial problem. And frequently what we find is a large source of leakage is paying over and beyond your baseline for things that should really have been in your baseline. Then there is what we call the watermelon, right? Missed service level credits, those invoices that have a sea of green when it comes to reporting service levels and KPIs. And the difficulty involved in getting into the service backup data, the raw data that accompanies the invoice, and discovering that a lot of those so-called greens are in fact red, and the corresponding service level credits for those. And then, of course, there are delivery and quality failures and missed entitlements. Just as a point of note, in the period that Sirion has been live, we have already started capturing a lot of this hard leakage. I will come back to how we do this. And in the last 12 months, in particular, of the 650 million of invoices that we processed, our clients were able to reduce those invoices by just under 7%, almost $44 million. So the fact that this is hard leakage and the fact that it's recoverable following the application of the best practices that Andrew spoke of earlier and that Sirion is trying to implement is a very tangible reality. Next slide. The Sirion approach to supplier governance can really be summed up on this slide. And the best version that I've heard is from my co-founder, Claude Murray, who used to head outsourcing for General Motors worldwide. And he's a former pilot. And he says, you really can't fly a plane by any one instrumentation guide. You know, it's not the compass alone, it's not the altimeter alone, it's not the wind direction alone. You have to take all of those, or the barometer, you have to take all 4 or 5 of those indicators into joint consideration when you look at flying a plane. And similarly, with managing a supplier, these are what we believe are the 5 core disciplines or meters that you need to manage. Obviously, as Andrew pointed out, it all begins with the contract, because the contract is the place which specifies what is supposed to happen, that very fundamental question. Performance then, if it's managed at the right and the granular level, tells you what actually happened. And by the granular level, we mean at the level of the deliverable, the obligation, the milestone, and tracking it literally real time at that microscopic level. At the finance level, the hygiene, of course, as Andrew pointed out, is in auditing the invoice. But then over and beyond that, there's also the issue of value assurance and managing other complex financial expectations. On the relationship side, it's a very interesting story. And the idea here is of moving away from a subjective CSAT scorecard-based approach to rating the supplier to establishing more data-driven ways of evaluating the relationship, such as how is the supplier responding to issues, actions, disputes, how are they responding in governance forums, how responsive in general is the data showing them to be versus our subjective perception of them. And then, of course, on the risk side, there has been a lot of talk of the increased regulatory policy and best practices that have come in, and we will talk a little about those too. So this broadly is the scope, and at Sirion what we believe is that the core of all of this being the contract, it's very important to see how technology can be brought in to leverage some of the work that we're trying to accomplish on the contracts in particular. Being unstructured in their natural language format, it's very important to see how we can leverage artificial intelligence to reduce the manual effort involved in capturing obligations, deliverables, financial artifacts. And that's one key element of technology. Similarly, on the service level and KPI management, it's very important to see how technology can automatically integrate with all the sources of raw data that are out there between the buyer and the supplier, whether it's ITSM tools like ServiceNow or Remedy, or it's project management tools like Clarity or MSPP. Suck out, if you will, the raw performance data and automatically real-time correlate it to what was expected within the contract. So that really is the role of technology there, and that really is what Sirion is heading to do. And on the invoice validation side, as Andrew pointed out, the real question is, can we take all these shards of glass, if you will, these thousands of little obligations and milestones, having tracked them through the contract, through the performance, and put together that picture retroactively and, in a sense, predict what the invoice should look like, even before the supplier's invoice actually comes in. And when the supplier's invoice finally comes in, to be able to contrast the two and see the delta between them. And that really is, in a sense, also this predictive invoicing element, the advanced technology developments that are taking place here. Next slide. And the good news really that's emerging, the product is relatively new. We have been on the market only about 19 or 20 months. But as I pointed out earlier, from the roughly 3 billion odd that is sitting on the system today, we're auditing actively about 59 of the world's largest suppliers from a total supply base of about 10,000 suppliers. And the results I've already told you before, we've managed to save our clients more than 6.5% of the total invoiced value that we have processed over the last 12 months. These are very encouraging early results. And I'll point out that the invoice savings or the hard savings percentage is only rising with every month. 6 months ago, it was under 5%. Today, it's almost 7%. And we believe it will keep rising till it hits the approximately 10% mark, when it will start to plateau. So this is indeed very good news for those of the companies and the CIOs who choose to actively confront the complex arena of performance and invoice validation. Next slide. To sum up, I mean, from our perspective, Sirion is a company that was for a very long time in the R&D phase. We were between 2012 and literally early 2015 in a series of intensive R&D cycles where we were trying to figure out how to solve the problem of unstructured natural language and contracts, unstructured performance data in the performance side, and unstructured invoice formats on the invoice validation side before releasing even the first version of a product in early 2015. What has been very heartwarming for us is the reception to that since the product was released. We are now working equally with companies in the private sector and the public sector, and within the private sector, companies across the board, finance sector, telecom, manufacturing, and so on and so forth. And what is fascinating is that over the last 7 or 8 months, the suppliers have started coming forward to Sirion and started engaging with us as well and asking us, A, for help to manage their strategic client accounts, and occasionally to partner with their clients in a joint adoption of Sirion. So this tells us that what Andrew was talking about earlier, that search for a common source of data, for a single source of truth, is in fact a joint aspiration. And as we build these systems, which are really a single pane of glass between the buyer and the supplier, we really are actively constructing the future. Thank you. These are some of the testimonials that Sirion's clients have provided. And what's very interesting, if you look at the bottom right here, Vestas, which is one of the world's largest energy companies, and in fact the largest wind energy company, their head of global IT outsourcing saying that they recovered the investment in technology within the first few months of deploying it. This is the power, in a sense, of what Andrew was hinting at throughout his presentation, that there is so much pent-up leakage here that literally a few months of doing the right things and you start recovering vast amounts of unlocked value. Thanks, Indus. Just a small case study on this. This is one example of a financial services client that Sirion has been working with. One of the most household logos in the world, and they're in the payment space. And we were able to go in there over a period of time, over a year and a half. They were literally the first client, and take over all their strategic IT suppliers, bring all of those complex obligations under our management, and bring about huge efficiencies in supplier performance over time. So, something that has completely changed the way that they view this mass of critical suppliers, any of whom stop working and you can't swipe your credit card anymore. So thanks, Indus. To sum up in terms of our journey so far, what we have seen is a truly horizontal deployment mode. On the left, you can see the number of industry verticals that Sirion's clients are spread through. We're seeing a very sharply increasing diversity in not just the IT services that you see in the middle, but also other complex use cases apart from third-party logistics and facilities. We're also helping companies like Bombardier to build trains and to manage train services in London Underground and many other complex services. So it's clear that what Andrew was talking about is not just limited to the CIO's bailiwick and to IT outsourcing in particular, but really any kind of complex services which is ring-fenced with service levels, KPIs, performance data is amenable to an approach of this kind. Thanks, Indes.
Thank you, Ajay. That was a great overview about what Sirion has achieved so far, so appreciate your insight on that. So just kind of wrapping up and kind of giving you a brief summary of what Andrew alluded to and what Ajay highlighted, and based on what I learned today, that a large amount of dollar value is locked because of ineffective governance and lack of alignment in the overall outsourcing engagements and of course complex services in the enterprise. And of course the problem gets exacerbated due to lack of sophisticated and new generation tools. What is enterprises and companies are looking at the CIOs to take the lead and adopt these specialized pieces of emerging software to enable IT and the organizations at large to reduce the inefficiencies which currently plague the departments in larger and smaller companies. And with that, I'm going to read out some of the questions which I've queued up. So the first one is slightly more tactical, and probably Andrew or Ajay, you could tackle that. And the question is that we are currently using SharePoint for managing contracts. What are we missing from a CLM point of view?
Yeah, great question. Andrew, if you like, I'm happy to take this one.
Well, I may take a stab on it as well, since we just published a whole Forrester wave on this. But let me start, and then Ajay, feel free to.
Absolutely. And for those of us who have used SharePoint in a variety of flexible and versatile ways over the last 15 years, by no means am I, what I'm about to say decries the versatility of that wonderful tool SharePoint, but really the more generic point that's at the root of the question. And what is at common, and it's not just SharePoint. It is pretty much all of classical contract repositories, whether it's Ariba or mTorus on the procurement side, or it's Salesforce or any other CRM tool on the sales side. The common denominator, the common element among all of these repositories and their approach to CLM is that they construct the repository like a graveyard. The contract is the dead body expressing the end of the natural life cycle of either procurement or sales. And like a dead body, it is buried in that graveyard with a name tag saying born this, died this. This is the metadata, if you will. And you know where you can find it, and you hope like hell it doesn't come back to life. This is very consistent with the kind of old approach to the contract, because if the contract was being waved around in a buyer-supplier context, the assumption was that the relationship had gone south. So my short answer is, if your repository is in SharePoint, what you should really be asking yourself is, how are all those micro obligations and deliverables and outcomes, the business end of the contract that is inside the contract, how is that being enabled through my SharePoint design? How am I bringing out those outcomes? How am I bringing them forward? Or is it more the case that after I store the contract in SharePoint, I then go back to Excel and create a fresh DNO tracker and have a whole separate manual overlay over and beyond the SharePoint? That is the question we have to ask ourselves, is how does the CLM repository and the authoring tool enable the bringing alive of the business end of the contract? So that's my view on this, Andrew.
I think my view is probably very much similar to yours. The major approach or major definition that we use when we define a CLM product is that a true CLM product treats the contract not as a document, but as a collection of discrete items, discrete terms and conditions that can be searched on, can be controlled item by item, and can be integrated and linked and pulled out for use in systems that use them. SharePoint, simply as Ajay says, is simply a place you store a document. But that doesn't allow you to get at what I think Ajay has correctly noted, the fact that it's a living object, a living business relationship that you need to be able to access in real time at that component level, at the term and condition level. And that's why SharePoint, in our view, it is not really going to help you in terms of being able to manage your vendor relationships. It simply becomes a place that, oh, if we need to look up what the vendor is, you can find it there, but it's not readily searchable, it's not readily findable. It's an inadequate approach to really being able to manage the vendor relationship.
Well, that's a fantastic answer. Thank you, Andrew and Ajay, for that. So I have another, I'm not sure if it's related, but there's a long winding question. Let me just kind of rephrase it. Basically, the poster is asking that they are moving from a traditional on-prem sourcing business for the IT department to largely moving to SaaS and cloud. There's an initiative underway where the CIO is moving everything to cloud. What should I do in order to move to cloud? This is kind of very open-ended. What services and tools I should be looking into?
Well, I think that I guess there are two aspects of the question. One is first of all, the transition from a on-premises to a SaaS. But secondly, actually, is a subset of it, which is that as you do that transition, in effect, now you have a new vendor relationship and a new vendor contract that you've got to manage to make sure that you actually get the benefits of that SaaS relationship that you want to get. Think of SaaS, in effect, as being a kind of an outsourcing agreement that the type of issue that we've just identified, you want to be applying. So, but let me first start with the first task. You have an existing on-premises solution for sourcing or CLM or others migrating to SaaS. There is, of course, a data migration issue. You've got to get the data into the new system. You've got to build your integration points. You've got to get that all set. This is standard conversion from one technology to another. There's a long history of what you need to do to make that transition happen. But I'm not going to spend too much time because of that history. I do want to note, though, that one of the key things when you move from licensed software to SaaS is, in fact, you're changing the nature of the relationship. When you have licensed software, in effect, you have an instance that you own. You can control it. You can customize it. You can get you can make it do the things that you want to do through customization. And yes, you want to get access to what the vendor's offering in the way of new innovations. You get access to their help desk if you've got issues. You want to get access to their next release. But you have a somewhat arm's length relationship. It's more of additional when you buy something, what you get. When you move to a SaaS, as I said, this actually becomes a kind of outsourcing relationship. So first of all, you need to be able to lobby the vendor for the things that you want. You can't customize, so getting features in is a matter of getting the vendor to add those in time as they make new versions of it, new releases coming out. But equally important is that monitoring, that management of the vendor and tracking the invoices that you're receiving. Making sure that the contract you have with this SaaS vendor is actually being reflected in the invoices that they're paying you. Making sure that if the contract specifies you're supposed to be paying so much per employee or per user, and your actual usage is below that, that's what the payment's going to be for. So one of the ironic points about the question is that that transition actually points to the type of solution that Sirion's offering to make sure you get the same value from your software SaaS vendor that you expect to get from your traditional outsourcing vendor.
Sure. Thank you, Andrew. And I think the next question is very much related. I'm going to shorten it. The question is SirionLabs solution meant to be a complement to e-invoicing or a supplement? And Tori Ajay can answer that.
Sure. Yeah, that's a very easy one. It's very much a supplement to e-invoicing. Sirion is not a payment processing or an invoicing tool per se. What it does is it provides an extra audit layer, an invoice validation layer to the services invoices that is otherwise missing in the system today. In fact, going back to the previous question, the only thing I would add to what Andrew, I think, covered pretty much all the aspects of that question. The only one thing I would add is the increasing modularity of e-procurement products today and the vendor's natural propensity to sell you all of those modules at once means that you have a set of active choices to make. And in my opinion, looking very carefully at the repository, contract repository design of the e-procurement suite and deciding whether that should be part of the package or whether you should pick a repository that's a little more modern and allows you to bring those contracts to life in the way that Andrew has been talking about, that's a very key decision that you're making as you implement the e-procurement suite.
And of course, just one comment is that we've been talking about this from the buyer perspective, but Ajay, you made some references to suppliers, and so suppliers contract works both ways, and having the ability of the supplier to understand better what they're supposed to be invoicing vis-a-vis against the contract, against performance, it's actually advantageous if the supplier has that. So remember, contracts can be used for buy side, but they can also be used for sell side. And that's another reason to look at CLM outside the context of an e-purchasing suite, because you may want to, especially if you're a supplier, look at that, how to use it with our customers in their contracts.
Super. Thank you, Andrew, and thank you, Ajay. With that, I bring the webinar to a close. I appreciate everybody's time and taking an hour out of their day and joining us. Ajay, again, thanks for joining us. And Andrew, thank you as well.
And thank you to all our kind listeners.
Okay. Thank you. Have a great day or a great evening, depending on the time zone. Talk to you guys later.